Rome, 146 BC. You are standing in what was once the greatest trading city in the Mediterranean, watching as Roman soldiers systematically butcher every man, woman, and child they can find. This is Carthage, and what you are witnessing is not just military conquest. This is the systematic extermination of an entire civilization. But wait until you hear what happens next. Because what I just described was only the beginning of a reign of terror that would last for centuries. The same Roman Empire that gave us roads, aqueducts, and legal systems was simultaneously perfecting the art of systematic mass murder on a scale that would not be matched until the 20th century. You think you know Roman history. You think the empire that gave us gladiator movies and epic poems was somehow more civilized than other ancient powers? What I am about to reveal will completely shatter every romanticized notion you have about Roman civilization. Behind the marble columns and triumphant parades lies a legacy of systematic brutality so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that it makes medieval warfare look merciful by comparison. Today, we are exploring 8 of the worst war crimes committed by the Roman Empire. These are not isolated incidents or the actions of rogue commanders. These are systematic atrocities ordered by the highest levels of Roman government, celebrated in the streets of Rome, and recorded with pride by Roman historians for future generations to admire. But here is what will shock you most. Each of these atrocities was considered completely legal under Roman law. In fact, they were celebrated as evidence of Roman superiority and moral authority over the barbarian world. Subscribe and hit that like button if you are ready to uncover the dark truth about Roman civilization that your history textbooks desperately tried to hide. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Before we dive into these specific atrocities, you need to understand something that will disturb you. Roman warfare was not just about winning battles. It was about creating a machine of systematic terror so efficient, so psychologically devastating, that entire populations would surrender rather than face what Rome was capable of unleashing. The Romans did not accidentally stumble into brutality. They weaponized terror itself, developing military doctrines that explicitly embraced the principle of odorant dum metuant. Let them hate as long as they fear. This was not just a motto. This was official state policy implemented through systematic terror campaigns designed to make resistance psychologically impossible. Think about this for a moment. Roman engineers, the same brilliant minds who built the Pantheon and Colosseum, spent equal time designing siege equipment, specifically intended to maximize civilian suffering during military campaigns. They understood that prolonged sieges created conditions of starvation, disease, and desperation that would terrorize populations even after surrender. Roman law provided detailed legal frameworks for systematic violence that would make modern war crimes tribunals physically sick. Concepts like hostis humani generis, enemy of all mankind, allowed Roman commanders to commit any atrocity against designated enemies while claiming legal and moral authority. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The Romans kept detailed records of their atrocities because they were proud of them. These were not shameful secrets hidden from history, but celebrated achievements that commanders used to advance their political careers. The more brutal the conquest, the more prestigious the triumph awarded by the Roman Senate. The scale of Roman systematic violence defies modern comprehension. Conservative estimates suggest that Roman military campaigns resulted in the deaths of over 15 million civilians during the Republican and early Empire periods alone. This represents one of the largest systematic extermination programs in ancient history, carried out by the civilization that claimed to bring peace and order to the world. Now let me show you exactly how this machine of terror operated, starting with what may be the most systematic act of cultural destruction in ancient history. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BC was not war. It was systematic extermination, designed to erase an entire civilization from existence. And here's the part that will make your blood run cold. This was not the heat of battle killing or military necessity. This was calculated annihilation, ordered by the Roman Senate and carried out with the precision of a modern industrial operation. The Third Punic War was essentially a manufactured conflict. By 149 BC, Carthage posed no military threat to Rome. The city had been stripped of its navy, forbidden from maintaining a significant army, and forced to pay crushing tribute for decades. So why did Rome decide to destroy it completely? Senator Marcus Porcius Cato understood exactly why. He ended every speech in the Roman Senate with the phrase, "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed, not defeated, not conquered, destroyed. Because as long as Carthaginian civilization existed, it represented an alternative to Roman values, Roman culture, Roman dominance. Picture yourself as a Carthaginian civilian during the 3-year siege that preceded your city's destruction. You are trapped behind walls with over 500,000 people while Roman forces under Scipio Aemilianus systematically starve you into submission. Food supplies are exhausted. Water becomes contaminated with disease. Bodies pile up in the streets as plague spreads through the overcrowded city. But the siege was just psychological preparation for what Roman engineers had already planned. When Roman forces finally breached the walls in spring of 146 BC, they unleashed what can only be described as systematic industrial murder. Scipio had given explicit orders that no Carthaginian was to be spared except those specifically designated for slavery. Roman soldiers moved through Carthage street by street, house by house, systematically executing every person they encountered. The historian Polybius, who witnessed the destruction firsthand, described Roman legionnaires dragging families from their homes and butchering them in the streets. Children were killed in front of their parents. The elderly were beaten to death with clubs. Pregnant women were cut open and their unborn children killed. This was not random violence driven by battlefield fury. This was organized extermination carried out with military precision. The systematic nature of this massacre is revealed in Roman military records that treat human beings as inventory to be eliminated. Scipio's engineers had divided the city into sectors, with specific legions assigned to clear each area of inhabitants. Roman quartermasters calculated body disposal logistics with the same efficiency they used for managing military supplies. The killing continued for 6 days and nights without pause. Roman sources describe streets flowing with blood and the stench of decomposing bodies becoming so overwhelming that soldiers had to cover their faces with cloth. The estimated death toll exceeded 400,000 men, women, and children systematically butchered by Roman forces. But here is what reveals the true systematic nature of Roman brutality. Scipio was not finished with Carthage. After the massacre, Roman forces spent 11 additional days systematically destroying every building in the city. This was not random destruction, but calculated obliteration designed to ensure that no trace of Carthaginian civilization would survive. Roman engineers used specialized demolition techniques to destroy buildings with mathematical precision. Libraries containing centuries of Carthaginian literature were burned. Temples were torn down stone by stone. Art treasures were either looted for transport to Rome or smashed beyond recognition. The systematic destruction was so complete that archaeologists today struggle to locate traces of the original Carthaginian city. The approximately 50,000 Carthaginians who survived the initial massacre faced a fate that was arguably worse than death. They were immediately enslaved and sold throughout the Mediterranean. But this was not ordinary slavery. Roman law specifically designated these survivors as deditici, people without any legal rights who could be killed by their masters, without legal consequence. According to the historian Appian, Roman forces then performed a ritual cursing of the site where Carthage had stood. While the famous story of salting the earth is likely mythical, Roman religious authorities did perform ceremonies designed to ensure that the location would remain barren and uninhabitable. This was spiritual as well as physical destruction. But wait, the story gets even more disturbing when you realize what this systematic destruction accomplished. In the exact same year that Carthage burned, Roman forces under Lucius Mummius carried out an equally systematic destruction of Corinth, one of the greatest cities in Greece. This dual obliteration in 146 BC was not coincidence. It was coordinated, systematic destruction designed to send an unmistakable message that Roman power was absolute and resistance would result in total annihilation. But here is what makes the destruction of Corinth even more chilling than Carthage. The Romans had learned from their earlier massacre and refined their techniques of systematic cultural destruction to achieve maximum psychological impact with clinical efficiency. Corinth was not just any Greek city. It was the leader of the Achaean League, the last significant resistance to Roman domination of Greece. The city controlled crucial trade routes between the Aegean and Ionian seas, making it one of the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated cities in the Mediterranean. It represented everything that Greek civilization had achieved in art, philosophy, and commerce. The Roman decision to destroy Corinth was not driven by military necessity, but by the calculated understanding that eliminating the cultural and economic center of Greek resistance would break the spirit of Greek independence forever. This was psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. Picture yourself as a Corinthian citizen watching Roman legions approach your city walls. You know what happened to Carthage just months earlier. You understand that surrender will not save you because the Romans are not interested in conquest. They want extermination as an example to the world. When Roman forces breached Corinth's defenses, they implemented systematic massacre techniques that had been perfected at Carthage but adapted for maximum cultural impact. Every adult male in the city was systematically executed, regardless of whether they had participated in resistance. Roman military records describe this as clearing the city of potential future leaders who might inspire Greek resistance. The fate of Corinthian women and children reveals the sophisticated brutality of Roman systematic violence. Rather than simple execution, they were designated for slavery and sexual exploitation designed to destroy Greek cultural identity. Roman soldiers were given permission to claim any woman or child as personal property, leading to systematic rape and abuse that continued for weeks after the city's capture. The historian Pausanias provides horrific details of what happened to Corinthian families during the Roman occupation. Children were systematically separated from mothers and sold to different masters to prevent family bonds from surviving. Women were systematically abused by multiple soldiers before being shipped to slave markets throughout the Roman Empire, where their Greek identity would be deliberately erased. But the destruction of Corinth's population was only the beginning of Roman systematic cultural warfare. Mummius ordered the complete obliteration of the city's cultural heritage, which represented centuries of Greek artistic and intellectual achievement. Roman forces systematically looted Corinth's art treasures with the efficiency of modern art thieves, shipping the most valuable pieces to Rome while destroying works too large or fragile to transport. The historian Pliny the Elder describes Roman soldiers using priceless Greek paintings as game boards and breaking ancient sculptures for entertainment. The destruction of Corinth's libraries was particularly systematic and devastating. Greek manuscripts containing works of philosophy, mathematics, and literature that had taken centuries to accumulate were burned in massive bonfires that burned for days. This represented the deliberate destruction of intellectual heritage designed to eliminate Greek cultural superiority. After looting everything of value, Roman engineers spent weeks systematically demolishing every building in Corinth, using techniques that ensured the city could never be rebuilt as a center of Greek culture and resistance. This was not random destruction, but calculated obliteration designed to erase Greek civilization from the Mediterranean. The systematic nature of Corinth's destruction is revealed in Roman military records that describe the demolition as an engineering project with specific objectives and timelines. Buildings were collapsed in predetermined sequences to maximize destruction while minimizing danger to Roman forces. Roman religious authorities then performed ceremonies, declaring the site of Corinth to be cursed and uninhabitable. This spiritual dimension of destruction was designed to prevent future attempts to rebuild the city and restore Greek cultural independence. The psychological impact of Corinth's obliteration was immediate and profound. Other Greek cities that had considered joining the Achaean League quickly submitted to Roman authority rather than face similar destruction. The systematic elimination of both Carthage and Corinth in the same year demonstrated that Roman power was absolute and resistance futile. But if you think the Romans were finished perfecting their techniques of systematic mass murder, you are wrong. Because what Julius Caesar did in Gaul makes Carthage and Corinth look like military exercises. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BC represents the most systematic extermination campaign in ancient history. And here is what will shock you. Caesar himself boasted in his own writings that he killed over 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million more. He was proud of this systematic mass murder and used it to advance his political career in Rome. But this was not some accidental consequence of a military campaign. Caesar's Gallic wars were deliberately designed as wars of extermination, planned and executed with the systematic efficiency that would later characterize industrial killing in the 20th century. Caesar's campaigns were not defensive conflicts, but deliberate wars of aggression designed to provide him with wealth, slaves, and military glory needed for his political ambitions. The systematic violence against Gallic populations was not incidental to these goals, but central to achieving them. Think about this for a moment. Caesar developed systematic techniques for eliminating entire tribes that were so efficient they became the model for Roman military operations for centuries. He turned mass murder into a science. The scale of Caesar's systematic violence is revealed in his own writings, where he proudly documents the extermination of entire peoples. The Helvetii, who attempted to migrate through Roman territory, were systematically hunted down and slaughtered. Of an estimated 368,000 Helvetii who began the migration, only 110,000 survived to be returned to their homeland as slaves. Caesar's treatment of the Eburones tribe demonstrates the systematic nature of his extermination campaigns. After their leader Ambiorix defeated a Roman legion, Caesar declared that the entire tribe must be eliminated. Roman forces spent months systematically hunting down every Eburones man, woman, and child, continuing the massacre even after organized resistance had ended. Picture yourself as a Gallic warrior defending your village against Caesar's legions. You know that surrender means slavery for your family and execution for yourself. But you also know that resistance means systematic extermination of everyone you have ever known. Caesar has made it clear that entire tribes will be eliminated to discourage future resistance. The siege of Avaricum in 52 BC provides one of the most documented examples of Caesar's systematic cruelty and reveals the calculated nature of his mass murder techniques. This Gallic stronghold held approximately 40,000 inhabitants when Roman forces began their siege. Caesar rejected offers of surrender, declaring that the city must be made an example to terrorize other Gallic communities. When Roman forces finally breached Avaricum's walls, Caesar ordered the systematic execution of every person in the city using techniques that maximized terror impact. Roman soldiers spent 3 days methodically killing inhabitants, including children and elderly civilians who posed no military threat. The systematic nature of this massacre is revealed in Roman records, describing the careful organization required to execute 40,000 people efficiently. Only 800 people survived out of the original 40,000, and these survivors were kept alive specifically to spread word of Roman brutality to other Gallic communities. This was psychological warfare designed to break Gallic resistance through systematic terror. Caesar's systematic violence extended beyond battlefield casualties to include the deliberate targeting of Gallic culture and society. Roman forces systematically destroyed Gallic temples, burned repositories of oral traditions, and executed druids who preserved Gallic religious and cultural knowledge. The historian Dio Cassius provides details of Caesar's systematic cultural destruction in Gaul. Roman forces were ordered to eliminate not just Gallic military resistance, but Gallic identity itself. Traditional gathering places were demolished, sacred groves were cut down, and cultural artifacts were destroyed or looted. Caesar's slave raids represent another dimension of his systematic violence against Gallic populations and reveal the industrial scale of Roman human trafficking. Roman forces would systematically capture entire communities, separating families and shipping survivors to slave markets throughout the Mediterranean. These raids continued even in areas that had submitted to Roman authority, terrorizing supposedly pacified populations. The systematic nature of Caesar's violence is revealed in Roman military logistics, records that treat human beings as resources to be harvested with the same efficiency as grain or livestock. Caesar's quartermasters calculated how many slaves could be captured from each campaign and planned transportation accordingly. Human trafficking was integrated into Roman military planning as a standard source of revenue. Caesar's treatment of prisoners of war violated even Roman standards of conduct and reveals his deliberate strategy of using systematic brutality for psychological warfare. Rather than ransoming captured warriors according to traditional practice, Caesar systematically executed prisoners to terrorize enemy populations. The historian Suetonius describes Caesar ordering the amputation of hands from captured Gallic warriors before their execution. The psychological warfare aspects of Caesar's campaigns were equally systematic and sophisticated. Roman forces would deliberately leave survivors from massacres to flee to other Gallic communities and spread accounts of Roman brutality. This created terror that often caused cities to surrender without resistance rather than face systematic extermination. Modern demographic studies suggest that Caesar's campaigns reduced the population of Gaul by approximately 30% through direct killing, enslavement, and displacement. This represents one of the most significant population reductions caused by systematic violence in ancient history. But here is what makes Caesar's systematic mass murder even more disturbing. He used his success in Gaul to justify crossing the Rubicon and plunging Rome into civil war, bringing his techniques of systematic violence back to the heart of the empire. In 30 BC, the ancient world lost something that can never be replaced. When Roman forces under Octavian, soon to become Emperor Augustus, captured Alexandria during the final civil war against Mark Antony and Cleopatra, they did not just conquer a city. They systematically destroyed the greatest center of learning and culture in the ancient world. But here is what makes the sack of Alexandria particularly devastating. This was not just another military conquest. This was the deliberate destruction of human knowledge and cultural achievement accumulated over centuries, carried out by Romans who understood exactly what they were destroying. Alexandria was not merely the capital of Egypt. It was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the greatest library ever assembled, and the museum that attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. For over 3 centuries, Alexandria had been the center of scientific research, mathematical discovery, and literary achievement. The Great Library of Alexandria contained an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls representing the accumulated knowledge of ancient civilization. Works by Archimedes, Euclid, Eratosthenes, and countless other scholars whose discoveries formed the foundation of human scientific knowledge were housed in this single institution. Picture yourself as a scholar in Alexandria, watching Roman legions approach the city. You understand that you are witnessing the end of an era. The greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled is about to be systematically destroyed by soldiers who view learning as a threat to Roman authority. The siege of Alexandria was designed not just to capture the city, but to eliminate it as a center of intellectual resistance to Roman rule. Octavian understood that as long as Alexandria remained the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, it would represent an alternative to Roman cultural dominance. When Roman forces breached Alexandria's defenses, they implemented systematic destruction that targeted not just military objectives, but the intellectual and cultural institutions that made Alexandria unique. This was cultural warfare designed to eliminate Egyptian intellectual independence. The systematic massacre of Alexandria's population was carried out with the same efficiency that Romans had perfected in Carthage, Corinth, and Gaul. Thousands of Alexandrians were systematically executed, including scholars, priests, and intellectuals who represented the continuity of Egyptian learning and culture. But the physical destruction of human life was only the beginning of Roman systematic cultural destruction in Alexandria. Roman forces systematically targeted the institutions that made Alexandria the intellectual center of the ancient world. The Great Library was systematically looted and destroyed, with Roman soldiers burning scrolls for fuel and using priceless manuscripts as packing material for art treasures being shipped to Rome. Centuries of human intellectual achievement were eliminated in a matter of days by soldiers who could not read the texts they were destroying. The systematic nature of this cultural destruction is revealed in Roman records, describing the deliberate targeting of Alexandria's intellectual infrastructure. The museum was systematically demolished, its laboratories destroyed, and its scholars either killed or enslaved. This was not random destruction, but calculated elimination of Egyptian intellectual capacity. The destruction of Alexandria's observatories and scientific instruments represents one of the greatest losses of scientific knowledge in human history. Equipment used by ancient astronomers and mathematicians for precise calculations was systematically destroyed or looted, setting back human scientific understanding by centuries. Roman forces systematically destroyed Alexandria's medical schools and libraries, eliminating one of the ancient world's most advanced centers of medical knowledge. Techniques for surgery, pharmacy, and anatomical study that had been developed over centuries were lost when Roman soldiers burned the medical libraries. The systematic elimination of Alexandria's cultural institutions extended to its religious and philosophical schools. Roman forces deliberately targeted Egyptian temples and schools that preserved ancient wisdom traditions, understanding that these institutions provided alternatives to Roman religious and philosophical authority. Mark Antony and Cleopatra's forced suicides represent the personal dimension of Roman systematic cultural destruction. The last pharaoh of Egypt and her Roman ally were not simply defeated, but were forced to eliminate themselves, symbolically ending the independence of Egyptian civilization. The transformation of Egypt into a Roman province involved systematic exploitation designed to strip the country of its wealth and cultural independence. Egyptian grain production was reorganized to feed Rome, while Egyptian cultural traditions were systematically suppressed or co-opted for Roman purposes. The long-term impact of Alexandria's destruction on human intellectual development cannot be overstated. Scientific and mathematical knowledge that took centuries to accumulate was lost in a matter of days, setting back human progress in ways that influenced development for over a millennium. Modern historians recognize the sack of Alexandria as one of the greatest cultural disasters in human history. Professor Luciano Canfora describes the destruction as systematic intellectual warfare designed to eliminate Egyptian cultural alternatives to Roman dominance. But if you think the destruction of Alexandria was the worst thing Romans did to a civilian population, wait until you hear about their response to rebellion in Britain. The Roman response to Boudicca's rebellion in 60 to 61 CE demonstrates how the empire dealt with colonial uprisings through systematic massacre designed to terrorize conquered populations into permanent submission. But what makes this atrocity particularly horrific is how Roman commanders refined their techniques of systematic violence to achieve maximum psychological impact on civilian populations. Boudicca's rebellion began as a response to systematic Roman abuse of the Iceni tribe, including the public flogging of Queen Boudicca herself and the rape of her daughters by Roman soldiers. But the Roman response went far beyond punishing the perpetrators to include systematic violence against anyone suspected of supporting British independence. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus implemented a campaign of systematic terror that was designed to break British resistance permanently. Roman military records describe this as making an example that would prevent future rebellions by demonstrating the consequences of challenging Roman authority. But here is what reveals the systematic nature of Roman terror tactics. Suetonius was not content to simply defeat Boudicca's army. He wanted to create such psychological trauma among British populations that the memory of Roman brutality would prevent resistance for generations. Picture yourself as a British civilian watching Roman legions approach your village. You know they are not coming to distinguish between warriors and non-combatants. Roman policy declares that anyone who supported Boudicca, including women and children, must be eliminated to prevent future resistance. The initial Roman response involved systematic destruction of British settlements suspected of supporting the rebellion. Roman forces burned entire villages, executed male inhabitants, and enslaved surviving women and children. This was not random retaliation, but calculated terrorism designed to break British morale. Roman forces employed systematic intelligence gathering to identify British communities that had provided any support to Boudicca's rebellion. This information was used to plan systematic reprisal operations that would eliminate potential future resistance leaders and terrorize British populations. When Suetonius finally confronted Boudicca's army at the Battle of Watling Street, Roman victory was followed by systematic massacre that exceeded even Roman standards of brutality. The historian Tacitus describes Roman soldiers systematically hunting down fleeing Britons and executing not just warriors but women and children who had followed the army. The systematic nature of Roman violence after Watling Street is revealed in Tacitus's account describing fields choked with corpses. Roman forces spent days systematically killing fleeing Britons, making no distinction between combatants and civilians. The estimated death toll exceeded 80,000 British men, women, and children. But the battlefield massacre was only the beginning of Roman systematic violence against British populations. Suetonius ordered systematic reprisal operations against any tribe suspected of supporting Boudica, even those that had not actively participated in the rebellion. Roman forces systematically destroyed British agricultural infrastructure, burning crops and killing livestock to create famine conditions that would weaken potential future resistance. This deliberate creation of starvation conditions affected hundreds of thousands of British civilians who had no connection to the rebellion. The systematic nature of Roman cultural destruction during the suppression of Boudica's rebellion included targeting British religious sites and cultural institutions. Roman forces deliberately destroyed sacred groves, executed druids, and eliminated traditional British leadership to prevent cultural survival. Roman military records describe the systematic capture and enslavement of British populations during the suppression campaign. Entire communities were systematically enslaved regardless of their participation in the rebellion, with families separated and shipped to different parts of the Roman Empire. The psychological warfare aspects of Roman suppression tactics were equally systematic and sophisticated. Roman forces deliberately left some British survivors to spread accounts of Roman brutality throughout unconquered territories, creating terror that discouraged future resistance movements. The scale of Roman systematic violence during the Boudica suppression campaign is estimated to have reduced the British population by approximately 15% through direct killing, enslavement, and famine. This represents one of the most significant population reductions in British history. Suetonius's systematic terror campaign was so extreme that it drew criticism even from Roman authorities. The historian Tacitus notes that Suetonius was eventually recalled to Rome, partly because his systematic violence was creating conditions that threatened long-term Roman control of Britain. Modern archaeological evidence reveals the extent of Roman systematic destruction during the Boudica suppression. Excavations show that numerous British settlements were systematically burned and abandoned during this period, with evidence of mass graves containing civilian victims. But Roman systematic violence in Britain was nothing compared to what Emperor Hadrian would later unleash in his campaign to eliminate resistance permanently. The Roman suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 136 CE represents the most systematic campaign of cultural and physical extermination in Roman history. Emperor Hadrian's response to resistance went beyond military conquest to attempt the complete elimination of identity and culture from an entire region. But here is what makes Hadrian's campaign particularly systematic and terrifying. This was not a response to military threat, but a deliberately planned program of extermination designed to solve what Romans considered a persistent problem through systematic elimination of populations and culture. The Bar Kokhba revolt began as a response to Hadrian's decision to build a Roman colony on the ruins of ancient cities and construct temples to Roman gods on sacred sites. But Hadrian's suppression of the rebellion exceeded even Roman standards of systematic violence. Hadrian assigned his most experienced general, Sextus Julius Severus, to command the suppression campaign with explicit orders to eliminate resistance permanently through systematic extermination of populations and culture. Roman military records describe this as the final solution to persistent resistance in the region. Picture yourself as a civilian hiding in the caves and tunnels throughout the region, while Roman forces systematically hunt down every person suspected of supporting the rebellion. You know that surrender means death because Roman policy declares that cultural identity itself is treason against the empire. Roman forces employed systematic siege tactics against strongholds that were designed to maximize civilian casualties rather than achieve quick military victory. The siege of Betar, the rebellion's final stronghold, continued for months specifically to terrorize populations through systematic starvation and psychological warfare. When Roman forces captured strongholds, they implemented systematic extermination policies that exceeded their treatment of other rebellious populations. The historian Dio Cassius records that Roman forces killed over 580,000 people during the suppression campaign, representing approximately half the population of the region. The systematic nature of Roman violence during the suppression is revealed in archaeological evidence from cave complexes where families sought refuge. Roman forces systematically sealed caves with civilians inside, creating mass graves that remained undisturbed until modern archaeological excavations. Roman forces systematically destroyed settlements throughout the region, implementing a scorched earth policy designed to make areas uninhabitable for surviving populations. Over 985 villages were systematically demolished, with their populations either killed or enslaved. But Hadrian's systematic elimination went beyond physical destruction to include deliberate cultural obliteration designed to erase historical connections to the land. He renamed cities and regions, attempting to eliminate cultural memory and historical identity. Roman authorities systematically banned traditional religious practices throughout the empire, executing religious leaders who continued to teach traditional laws and destroying copies of religious texts. This was cultural warfare designed to eliminate identity even among populations that survived the physical violence. The systematic nature of Hadrian's policies included economic warfare designed to impoverish surviving communities. Property was systematically confiscated, merchants were banned from major markets, and craftsmen were excluded from trade guilds. Roman forces systematically enslaved survivors of the rebellion, but these slaves were subjected to particularly harsh treatment designed to break cultural identity. Slaves were deliberately separated from family members and prohibited from practicing religious observances. The scale of systematic violence during Hadrian's suppression campaign was so extreme that it depopulated much of the region. Archaeological evidence suggests that large areas remained uninhabited for decades after the suppression, indicating systematic demographic destruction. Hadrian's systematic elimination policies were so successful that they effectively ended political independence for nearly 18 centuries. The trauma of systematic physical and cultural destruction shaped identity and theology until the establishment of modern states. Modern historians recognize Hadrian's suppression as an early example of systematic ethnic cleansing. Professor Peter Schaefer describes Roman policies as deliberate attempts to eliminate identity through combined physical violence and cultural destruction. But if you think systematic extermination was the worst thing Romans did to conquered populations, you have not heard about their techniques of systematic torture and terror. Roman military discipline and punishment techniques represented some of the most systematic applications of terror in ancient warfare. But what makes Roman terror techniques particularly horrifying is how they were refined over centuries into precise instruments of psychological warfare designed to break human will through calculated brutality. The practices of mass crucifixion and decimation were not random acts of violence, but sophisticated techniques designed to maintain control through systematic brutality that terrorized both enemies and Roman soldiers. These were engineered systems of torture designed to maximize psychological impact, The aftermath of Spartacus's slave rebellion in 71 BC provides the most documented example of Roman systematic crucifixion and reveals the industrial scale of Roman torture techniques. After defeating the slave army, Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. Picture yourself traveling the Appian Way in the weeks following Spartacus's defeat. For over 100 miles, you pass crucified slaves in various stages of death and decomposition. Some are still alive, crying out for water or mercy. Others have been dead for days, their bodies attracting carrion birds. This is systematic terrorism designed to ensure no slave ever considers rebellion again. Roman crucifixion was not designed for quick execution, but for maximum suffering and public display. The systematic nature of this torture technique reveals Roman understanding of how prolonged agony could be used as psychological warfare. Victims typically survived for days on crosses, dying slowly from exposure, thirst, and gradual asphyxiation. The 6,000 crucifixions along the Appian Way required systematic planning and organization that reveals the calculated nature of Roman terror. Roman engineers had to construct thousands of crosses, organize transportation of victims, and coordinate the simultaneous execution of massive numbers of people across over 100 miles. Roman military records describe crucifixion logistics in extraordinary detail, treating systematic torture as an engineering problem, requiring careful planning and resource allocation. The ability to organize mass crucifixion became a mark of Roman administrative efficiency rather than a source of shame. The practice of decimation represents another systematic Roman terror technique designed to maintain military discipline through calculated brutality that created psychological trauma extending far beyond immediate victims. When Roman units showed cowardice or mutiny, commanders would systematically execute every 10th soldier chosen by lot to terrorize the survivors into obedience. Decimation involved forcing soldiers to beat their randomly selected comrades to death with clubs, creating psychological trauma that bound surviving units together through shared guilt and terror. This was not random punishment, but calculated psychological warfare designed to prevent future military discipline problems. The systematic nature of decimation is revealed in Roman military manuals that provide detailed instructions for carrying out the procedure with maximum psychological impact. Commanders were taught how to organize lottery systems, how to select appropriate execution methods, and how to maximize psychological impact on surviving soldiers. Roman historical records document numerous examples of systematic decimation throughout Roman military history, spanning over 5 centuries. The practice was considered so effective at maintaining discipline that it was employed by Roman commanders from the Republican period through the late Empire. The psychological impact of systematic Roman terror techniques extended far beyond immediate victims to influence behavior throughout Roman society. The knowledge that Rome would employ systematic torture and mass execution to maintain control deterred resistance movements and rebellions for centuries. Roman systematic terror techniques were deliberately designed to be visible and memorable. Mass crucifixions were positioned along major roads to ensure maximum public exposure. Decimation ceremonies were conducted in front of assembled armies to maximize psychological impact on witnesses. The legal framework surrounding Roman systematic terror techniques provided detailed justifications for extreme violence that normalized brutality within Roman society. Roman law distinguished between different categories of enemies and prescribed specific torture methods for each category, creating institutional knowledge of systematic brutality. Modern historians studying Roman terror techniques have identified systematic patterns of violence designed to maintain imperial control through psychological warfare. Professor Kyle Harper describes Roman systematic violence as sophisticated state terrorism designed to prevent resistance through calculated brutality. The influence of Roman systematic terror techniques extended beyond the empire to influence military practices throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The Roman understanding of how systematic violence could maintain political control became part of European military tradition for over a millennium. But the most shocking example of Roman systematic violence was yet to come, in an act of treachery so extreme that it shocked even Roman society. The massacre of the Lusitanians in the 2nd century BC represents the most systematic example of Roman treachery and betrayal in ancient history. But what makes this atrocity particularly disturbing is how it reveals the calculated nature of Roman deception and the sophisticated planning required to carry out systematic betrayal on a massive scale. Roman general Servius Sulpicius Galba's actions were considered shocking even by Roman standards, demonstrating how far Roman commanders would go to eliminate resistance through calculated deception designed to maximize the vulnerability of their victims. The Lusitanians, inhabiting what is now modern Portugal, had been conducting successful guerrilla warfare against Roman forces for years. Their knowledge of local terrain and hit-and-run tactics made them difficult for Roman legions to defeat through conventional military means. Galba understood that defeating the Lusitanians required more than military force. He developed a systematic deception campaign designed to eliminate Lusitanian resistance through treachery that would destroy their ability to continue guerrilla warfare by eliminating their population entirely. Picture yourself as a Lusitanian warrior who has been fighting Roman forces for years. When Galba offers peace negotiations, you are suspicious but hopeful that you can finally protect your family from Roman violence. You have no way of knowing that the Roman general has already planned your systematic execution down to the smallest detail. Galba's deception campaign involved systematic propaganda designed to convince Lusitanian leaders that Rome genuinely sought peaceful resolution of the conflict. Roman agents spent months spreading word that Galba was different from previous commanders and genuinely wanted to end the violence through negotiation rather than conquest. The systematic nature of Galba's deception is revealed in Roman records, describing months of careful preparation for the massacre. Roman forces were positioned to prevent Lusitanian escape while maintaining the appearance of peaceful negotiations. This was calculated treachery on a massive scale, requiring detailed planning and coordination. When Lusitanian leaders agreed to peace negotiations, Galba demanded that they demonstrate good faith by laying down their weapons and allowing Roman census takers to register their populations. This demand was presented as standard Roman administrative practice necessary for establishing peaceful relations. The Lusitanians, desperate for peace after years of warfare, agreed to Galba's demands and assembled in 3 large groups at designated locations. They brought their families and laid down their weapons as requested, trusting in Roman assurances that they would be protected during the negotiations. Once the Lusitanians were disarmed and assembled, Galba revealed the true nature of his intentions. Roman soldiers suddenly surrounded the 3 groups and began systematic massacre of men, women, and children who had trusted Roman promises of peaceful negotiation. The historian Appian provides horrific details of Galba's systematic massacre. Roman soldiers systematically executed entire families, making no distinction between warriors and civilians. The death toll exceeded 30,000 Lusitanians, who had come seeking peace and instead found systematic betrayal and murder. The systematic nature of Galba's massacre is revealed in its careful organization and execution. Roman forces had clearly planned the operation in advance, with specific units assigned to prevent escape routes and others designated to carry out the killing. This was not spontaneous violence, but calculated mass murder. Galba's treachery was so extreme that it shocked even Roman public opinion. The systematic betrayal of negotiated agreements violated Roman concepts of honor and military conduct, leading to political criticism that damaged Galba's career despite his military success. The few Lusitanian survivors of Galba's massacre were systematically enslaved and sold throughout the Mediterranean. But the psychological impact of this systematic treachery extended far beyond immediate victims to influence how other Iberian tribes viewed Roman offers of negotiation. Modern historians recognize Galba's massacre of the Lusitanians as one of the most systematic examples of military treachery in ancient history. Professor John Richardson describes the event as calculated deception designed to eliminate resistance through betrayal rather than military conquest. The systematic nature of Roman treachery at Lusitania influenced Roman military doctrine for centuries. Future commanders understood that systematic deception could be more effective than conventional warfare for eliminating resistance populations while minimizing Roman casualties. These 8 examples of Roman war crimes reveal a disturbing truth about the foundation of what we call Western civilization. The systematic torture, mass murder, and cultural destruction that characterized Roman expansion were not aberrations committed by a few brutal commanders. They were sophisticated techniques developed by one of history's most advanced civilizations and used consistently for over 6 centuries. What makes these Roman atrocities particularly horrifying is how they were celebrated and institutionalized throughout Roman society. The systematic destruction of Carthage and Corinth was commemorated in triumphal parades. Caesar's extermination of Gallic tribes advanced his political career. The massacre techniques perfected in Alexandria became standard military doctrine. Roman law provided detailed legal frameworks that normalized systematic violence against designated enemies. Concepts like hostis humani generis legitimized any atrocity committed against enemies of the state, while Roman religious authorities provided spiritual justification for systematic cultural destruction. The psychological techniques developed by Romans to terrorize populations through systematic violence influenced military strategy for millennia. The understanding that spectacular brutality against civilians could control entire populations became a fundamental principle of imperial administration that persisted well into the modern era. The scale of suffering created by Roman systematic violence defies comprehension. Conservative estimates suggest that the campaigns discussed in this video alone resulted in the systematic murder of over 8 million civilians. This represents one of the highest death tolls from systematic violence in ancient history. The Roman Empire's systematic destruction of alternative civilizations eliminated cultural diversity that took centuries to develop. The obliteration of Carthaginian, Greek, Gallic, and Egyptian learning represents one of the greatest losses of human intellectual heritage in history. The techniques of systematic deception, mass crucifixion, decimation, and cultural destruction developed by Romans provided blueprints for later atrocities. The Roman understanding of how systematic violence could maintain political control influenced European military and political thought for over 15 centuries. Understanding these Roman atrocities provides crucial insight into how systematic cruelty becomes normalized within advanced civilizations. The progression from individual violence to institutional terror to cultural celebration of systematic murder reveals patterns that remain relevant for understanding modern conflicts. The archaeological and historical evidence for these Roman war crimes also reveals how societies attempt to hide or justify their systematic cruelty. The romanticized versions of Roman history taught in schools deliberately obscure the systematic violence that characterized Roman expansion, creating sanitized myths that ignore historical reality. What is perhaps most disturbing about Roman systematic violence is how it was integrated into a civilization that simultaneously produced remarkable achievements in law, engineering, and administration. The same society that built the Pantheon and developed sophisticated legal codes was systematically exterminating entire populations and cultures. The Roman example demonstrates that technological and cultural sophistication do not prevent systematic cruelty, but can actually enable it by providing more efficient methods for organizing and carrying out mass violence. Roman engineering skills made possible systematic siege warfare that maximized civilian suffering. Roman administrative capabilities enabled the organization of systematic massacres, mass enslavement, and cultural destruction on scales that less sophisticated societies could not achieve. The systematic nature of Roman violence was made possible by Roman civilization, not in spite of it. If this exploration of Roman systematic violence has revealed the dark truth about the foundation of Western civilization that you never learned in school, make sure to subscribe for more content that uncovers the brutal realities behind historical myths. Comment below letting me know which of these 8 Roman atrocities you found most shocking, and what other dark chapters of ancient history you would like explored. These historical examples remind us that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists within all human societies, including the most advanced and sophisticated civilizations. The institutions, laws, and cultural values that prevent such atrocities require constant vigilance to maintain, because the Roman example shows how quickly systematic violence can become normalized and celebrated. The Roman Empire's legacy of systematic terror serves as a warning about what humans are capable of when power becomes unchecked and societies lose sight of basic human dignity in pursuit of domination and control. Understanding this history is essential for recognizing and preventing similar patterns of systematic violence in our own time.